Hello, everybody. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming out on I think it's a nice Saturday, right? It was nice when we got in an hour ago. I assume it's still nice out. My name is John Williams. I'm the editor of Book World at the Washington Post, which excitingly came back in the fall in print after a few years away. Thanks for reading, and thanks for being here. I'm going to just quickly introduce our guests up top. We have Francisco Cantú, Sylvia Earle, Candice Millard, and Simon Winchester, a very distinguished group. And they'll each be presenting for a bit, and then I will speak to them, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions from you, because I'm sure you will have them. Francisco Cantú, at 23 years old in 2008, enlisted as a U.S. Border Patrol agent. The grandson of a Mexican immigrant, he was convinced that the only way to really know the place, to get past the many abstracted ideas about it, would be to experience it for himself. He spent the next 4 years working in the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. His acclaimed memoir, The Line Becomes a River, published in 2018, recounts those years with what The Guardian called raw-nerved tenderness. His writing and translations have appeared in Best American Essays, Harper's, N+1, and many other places. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm very glad that today he's here in Washington and will be our first presenter.
Good morning, everyone. Really wonderful to be here. I went to school here in Washington, D.C. I remember coming to the Kennedy Center for events, so it's really kind of surreal to be here presenting. But anyway, so I'm Francisco Cantú. I'm really not an expert on the Rio Grande, but I'm going to talk about it for the next 12 minutes. You know, my book, which John mentioned, is not really expressly about the river, but I'll talk about sort of my connection and some of those connections to the river. So it's a little bit of a roundabout one. I spent part of my childhood in West Texas. My mother was a park ranger for the Guadalupe Mountain National Park. And I'm also going to start my timer so that I don't go over time. So excuse me, that always takes a little bit of navigation. There we go. So yeah, I was familiar with sort of the terrain of the Rio Grande from spending some time there, but you know, my real familiarity is with the Sonoran Desert. I grew up in Arizona. Arizona is where I spent most of my time working for the Border Patrol after graduating from college. And I think you know, of course, so there's an image here of the U.S.-Mexico border. This is how it would look if you just called it up on Google Maps. And you know, as you can see, the border, as you're going from west to east, you know, is this kind of like long, straight, pivoting lines up until you get to El Paso, where it becomes the Rio Grande. So for most of my experience with the borderlands, you know, being in the Arizona desert where I worked, is of a very sort of like fixed and rigid line sort of drawn across the landscape. But I made a few visits during those years, you know, certain kind of like deployments to the Rio Grande, and I kind of became fascinated with it as this sort of natural environment that holds sort of like a counter-example, even as it is like serving as a border, you know, of a place where sort of like the rigidity of those straight lines sort of falls away. So I'll talk a little bit about the Rio Grande as a river. It's 2,000 miles long. It's the second longest river in the United States after the Mississippi-Missouri system. And so this is a map of the watershed. And you know, as you can see here, there's a number of like really prominent cities for the region. Albuquerque is the largest city in New Mexico in the Rio Grande watershed. El Paso, Ciudad Juarez is the largest city in the you know, on the border. Chihuahua is the largest city in New Mexico's neighboring state. And then Monterrey down in the sort of southeast corner is sort of constantly jockeying with Guadalajara as the second or third largest city in all of Mexico. So you know, the watershed of the Rio Grande you know, is really immense. But I think you know, what really makes the Rio Grande unique is that for 2/3 of its length, it serves as the border. And here, kind of what I was talking about, oh, wait a minute. Can I go back? Yeah, I can. Let's see, might need somebody backstage to click on the video in order to start it, because this should be a film.
Can someone backstage click on the video?
I'm supposed to just click here and it starts, but that takes me to the next slide. So the video that I hope we're about to see sort of exemplifies what I was talking about earlier, this idea of kind of the rigidity of the line becoming fluid. It's a video that's composed of a bunch of satellite images, again, taken from like Google Earth. Yeah, I don't know. Let's see here. I hear some commotion backstage. They're discussing. It was supposed to be very simple. And now I'm just stuck. I can't go any direction. Let's see here.
You can't play it. We'll just go for it. Okay. Sorry, Francisco. I think we'll have to skip the video for now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's see. I also am now stuck with my slide. I wasn't going to have a PowerPoint, but now I do, and now I'm stuck with it. So anyway,
describe the video in full detail.
Yeah, the thing that I was going to talk about while this video is playing is sort of a lot of the mythology with which we sort of see the river today. And I think sort of the part of the river that most of us think of when we hear about the Rio Grande is the 2/3 of it that is sort of this militarized space on the Mexican border, not really the 1/3 of it that runs through New Mexico. So that mythology I think is is very old, right? It goes back to the period of Manifest Destiny, sort of. The language of the Wild West, the idea of the frontier as this sort of dangerous space, this kind of like buffer zone at the edge of the nation, a lot of disorder needs to be tamed, a hostile landscape that's sort of like inherently hostile, violent in and of itself. And so I think like this rhetoric, while we sort of think of the West as being closed. And that is a thing of the past. I think when you live in the borderlands or you spend time in the borderlands, that rhetoric is very much still sort of alive and part of the feeling of being there. And it also is, I think, what sort of leads us to modern border enforcement. So I don't know if anybody backstage can just get the photos back because now I'm just stuck on this screen. There we go. Great, awesome. So this is an image from the original boundary survey between the U.S. and Mexico. So today's boundary was established after the 1948 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And there were a series of surveys that took place. There was one in 1850, another in 1853 after the Gadsden Purchase, 1857, 1892. And I think we sort of have like a whimsical understanding of these surveys, right? It was horse-drawn carriages, people with these sort of like old-fashioned engineering equipment, sort of taking measurements by latitude and longitude. But I think that if you think about it, this was like all of the top-of-the-line technology and equipment of the day. So there were artists out on these surveys. This is an artist rendering from one of the surveys. There were cooks, engineers. There was like steel and stone and concrete that was brought along these surveys. So in a way, I sort of think that this is kind of like the first step on the path towards sort of border infrastructure. The thing that was left behind by these surveys were these little sort of pillars along the border. And one other thing that the surveyors noticed, this thing is not working, there we go, is that the river moved. It shifted a lot. So the treaty stated that the border existed in the deepest part of the channel. That was to be the boundary between both nations. So what these surveyors found is that the river would shift from one season to the next. It would flood, and so we have a number of reminders of this in the borderlands still today. There's the El Chamizal National Monument in El Paso, which is this piece of land where the border had to be the channel of the border had to be sort of concretized in order to prevent it from moving anymore. And there was a big, both presidents came. There was a big treaty negotiated, a bunch of DC stuff, there's entire small communities and towns where they were in Mexico and now they're in the United States or the other way around. There's a church, the Socorro Mission outside of El Paso, after a big flood. It's now in the United States. It used to be in Mexico. The fluidity of the border that I keep talking about as this sort of metaphor is actually a very, real and tangible thing. Today, let's see if we can get there. Oh, that was the wrong one. That part, I think that part was my fault. Anyway, I hope the rest of you guys don't have a presentation. I'm just kidding. But anyway, today, this is what large portions of the river look like along the border. The infrastructure that exists along our border, so that it's the most militarized border in the Americas on this continent, which makes it one of the most militarized borders around the world. It's far from, an open and fluid thing. One place where I think is an exception, a sort of island that reminds us of what the border perhaps used to be like on the Rio Grande is Big Bend National Park. I don't know if any of you have been there. This is a place that I think is really interesting. It's a place where I spent a lot of time, and it's interesting as a place where sort of the mythology of American wilderness, the model of our national parks where people are sort of vacated from the terrain in order to have this sort of empty, pristine landscape where visitors come to find solace and feel the power of nature. The model in Mexico is very different. And here you can sort of see Big Bend National Park and all of the surrounding public lands that are administered on the other side of the border by Mexico's equivalent of the national park system. I believe altogether there's 3 million contiguous acres of wilderness administered by 5 distinct entities, which you can kind of see here represented on the map. There's the National Park Service, Texas Fish and Wildlife, and then 3 different entities in Mexico, as well as some private entities. So I think it's an interesting terrain because there's a certain paradox I think that's on display in a place like Big Bend, where we have our continent's most militarized border. But if you go there as a visitor, you can kind of wade into the waters. As you can see here, it's there is not a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of enforcement. By fortune of the geography there, there's very little roads. There's very little smuggling or traffic activity that's happening there. So it sort of is a place where we can be reminded of the natural state of the borderlands. On the Mexican side, I mentioned the U.S. model. On the Mexican side, there are many communities inside these protected lands. So this is, their park ranger, Javier Ochoa, crouching down looking at a garden that the Mexican government has helped pay for with some local residents. This is one of the canyons here. The superintendent of the Big Bend National Park loves to talk about, oh, we don't need walls here because we have natural walls. These are some of those, a lot of canyons. This is a place where people from Boquillas in Mexico wade over the Rio Grande and leave sort of souvenirs. It's a little town that really depends on the tourism that comes from the national park. You could take a boat across and spend the afternoon, have a horseback ride or something like that. there's a note here. I visited during COVID, and the town was just like, decimated because there were no visitors inside the park. So anyway, I'll sort of leave us with the idea of places like this that kind of exist as reminders of the natural state of the borderlands. Places where we can sort of like think about what the river has been and what the river might be in the future. Yeah, there's some nice cats, and just a little reminder of the 1/3 of the river that is not a border. And I like to really kind of like end on thinking about that part of the river, because this is a place where you can see the river unsaddled from that burden of demarcation. And this is a photo that I'll sort of leave us with, taken in southern Colorado, looking up at the headwaters of the Rio Grande in the San Juan Mountains, which are those snow-capped mountains in the distance. And I like to think, I like to hold this terrain in my mind a lot when I think about the Rio Grande. This is sort of like the land of the Pueblo people, who I think have this really amazing legacy of resistance, that, a reminder of like the impermanence of empire, because these people kicked out the Spanish conquistadors. It was the most powerful empire in the world at the time, and kept them out of their terrain at bay for 12 years, over a decade. So I think it's a great place to come and sort of be reminded of everything that the river can be. So thanks.
I am not going to have nearly enough time for my follow-up questions. So we'll get to the next presenter, Sylvia Earle. To be clear, preparing the biographies of all 4 of our guests today made me feel bad about myself and my accomplishments. And that's how it should be. That's how you know you have a good panel. If you feel smaller and smaller as you put together the bios, this is going to be a good event. But with the case of 3 of the people on this stage, if I allow myself to be Walter Mitty and fantasize, I can say, oh, well, I write and edit, and I could. Sylvia Earle does things that I literally cannot imagine doing. She is a marine biologist and oceanographer who has spent many thousands of hours underwater all over the world. She was, in the early 1990s, the chief scientist of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She's helped to pioneer submersible robotics to study the deep ocean, including through her company Deep Ocean Exploration and Research, DOER, which she founded in 1992. She's devoted to the protection of a worldwide network of marine areas, work partly undertaken through Mission Blue, another company she founded. She also has or had what I think is maybe the coolest title for a job, which is that she was, for National Geographic, an explorer in residence. Very cool. And she's also written more than a dozen books. Seriously, leave something for the rest of us to do. She's had, quite simply, one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of her field, and it's a real honor to have her here today. Sylvia Earle.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here with you. Just a week ago, I was privileged to be at sea with Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist. He was impressed that I was coming to speak at the Kennedy Center. So, if only he knew. I am here to speak for the big water, the ocean. From afar, now we know, thanks to astronauts who've been high in the sky, Earth is this little blue miracle, a biogeochemical miracle that is unique, as far as we know, in all of the universe. There are plenty of places with rocks, and there are plenty of places, it appears, with water elsewhere. But this is the only place blessed with a living ocean, living water on the land, as well as in the sea. And we carry water around with us. All life requires one thing, water. There are other things that life requires, but without the water, there's no life, no blue, no green, no water, no us. And where is the water on Earth? Actually, 97% of it is out there in the ocean. No ocean, no rivers. It's the It's the ocean that really dominates and sets Earth apart from, let's say, Mars, where apparently there's some water, but it's not abundant and probably, although we don't know for sure, has no life. Certainly there are no whales, no elephants, no big human cities. And when you think about it, the miracle is there isn't much water when you add the scope, the scale of the physical part of Earth. That's little blue blob you see, according to the scientists at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who crunched the numbers. That's all the water there is. 97% of the ocean, 3%, most of it locked up in polar ice, and the rest is in us and other terrestrial creatures. It's in the air, in clouds. It's in the rivers, the lakes, streams. It's the water that makes Earth hospitable, habitable, but it's also the fact that Earth is alive and has been alive for several billion years that makes our existence possible. I don't know where along the way I heard about this, learned about this. Certainly I didn't learn it in school. In fact, nobody really thought about it when I was a kid a few years ago. It's becoming more obvious to more people, and it's beginning to trickle into textbooks and into conversations about the water, about how the ocean and climate are inextricably connected. But more than that, that it's the living water, the carbon in life that we track when we're looking at climate change. Follow the carbon, whether you're an economist or a biologist. It'll take you not only to where the carbon is in trees, in life on the land, but it certainly leads you into the ocean. Now we know this magical water, the material that can serve and be vapor as clouds or ice, and as a liquid filled with life. That's the key. The ocean may seem, if you just look at the surface, that's a lot of water. Yeah, it is. But it's home for most of life on Earth. That's another big idea that I didn't learn right away in my education about the nature of nature. But when you realize that, although it doesn't, when you look at that little ball of water that is spread out over all of the land that is mostly ocean, it is just filled with life. The average depth of the ocean, is 2.5 miles. Think about that distance from where you're seated now. 2.5 miles is the average depth of the ocean. That's where the Titanic rests. Maximum 7 miles, 11 kilometers from the surface. And there's life all the way down. But it's that upper layer where most of the action in terms of generating oxygen and capturing carbon actually exists. Maybe down to 300, 400, even 1,000 feet. But that's, again, just the top of the ocean that does much of the capturing of the sun's energy and generating much of the oxygen that we're breathing right now. But it's the food, then also the carbon cycle that enters the ocean through the action of those miniature forests that sweep the planet and feed those miniature, herds, the galaxy of life in the ocean, zooplankton, that in turn feeds the little fish, that in turn feed the bigger fish, and pretty soon you have a carbon cycle in action. And if you're lucky, you get to be out in the middle of it and see this is what shapes the chemistry of the planet. The passage of not just carbon, but phosphorus, sulfur, the whole mix of ingredients that we're made of, that fish are made of, that all forms of life are made of, the elements, the basic elements that flow through life. And here we are as witnesses in the 21st century to the actions that our species is imposing on the waters of the world that were innocent of anything that humans have now done to the planet. We have this habit of using the ocean and the waters of the land as well, both to take things out, largely to eat or turn into products like fish and shrimp and things, but also to use as a garbage dump. It's amazing. We're right at this critical point in time, 21st century, when we're beginning to see the consequences of our actions. Nature is not just free to be used as a dump site or as a place to just continue taking. Maybe it was 1,000 years ago, but now there are 8 billion of us, and Earth doesn't change in the size. So once it seemed like, hey, there's so many tuna out there, we can take them and just fill grocery stores, fill our, there's so many tuna, we could never run out of tuna. But now we know that not only tunas, but other creatures in the sea are greatly diminished. Sharks are down to about 10% of what they were when I was a kid. We're really good at finding, capturing, and turning them into shark fin soup, into shark steak, or whatever it is. Whales. We once upon a time treated whales as products. Oil, bone, just using whales for fertilizer. It seemed like a good idea at the time because it seemed like there were a lot of whales at the time. But think that all preceding history developed this innocent planet filled with life that when we came along, really effectively starting about 10,000 years ago with our civilization, we used nature like all other animals, all other creatures, even trees use the world around them. They take water, they take space, but no one creature has ever taken as much as quickly as humans have, 10,000 years. Go back even 500 years when our numbers had reached 500 million, or 1800 when we reached 1 billion. Our impact on the natural world was still relatively modest as compared to where we are today. But when whalers started to use whales, they just seemed like there are plenty of them. We can't run out of whales. But we're taking not just the whales, we've taken what the whales eat. What do they eat? A lot of things. Sperm whales, the ones that were on that image, are largely focused on squid. And so are we. Calamari, by the ton. This is just Monterey of this time last year. But around the world, squid fleets are out taking the food that the creatures that have no choices, they are reliant on squid, their version of calamari. Big ships, taking them by the ton, not just little boats like the ones off Monterey. Stripping the ocean of life, the way we used to do with whales. The good news is we've changed with whales. We don't turn them into dog food and people food and oil and bone anymore. We've come to love whales and to treat them with dignity and respect. It's a change that has come about as we have come to begin to appreciate whales as living creatures, fellow creatures. The biggest brains on the planet are sperm whales. They're smart enough not to do themselves in by consuming so much that the system actually changes. Sharks, as I say, have really been depressed mightily. When I started diving into the ocean, I was told to watch out for the sharks. There are man-eaters out there. Until I worried, said, I don't have to worry about man-eaters, but now the sharks have to worry about man-eating sharks because we're consuming them by the ton. Millions of tons have literally been bitten by us. There's a new thing on the horizon as we have extended our taking from taking wildlife now into the deep sea. In fact, this summer, in July, the International Seabed Authority, an agency appointed by the United Nations some years ago, when the knowledge about the deep sea and the importance of the ocean and life in the ocean to all of us everywhere all the time, shaping climate, shaping weather, driving the chemistry of the planet. Deep sea mining now looms on the horizon. The biggest land giveaway, ocean giveaway, as companies and a few nations are gearing up to get licenses to mine the deep sea. So what does that mean? It means that the global commons, about half of the world beyond where nations claim territory, are now poised to target minerals in the deep sea. I mean, we're already mining life, whales, squid, tuna, you name it. But now turning our attention away from the land, although much of the mining has been and will continue to take raw materials from the heart of the earth, but now from the heart of the ocean. Those little lumps contain minerals that are valuable for things like batteries, computers, electric cars, you name it. But the sacrifice to systems that we've never been able to get to before are now vulnerable to our tastes, with machinery that makes me just gasp when I think about the damage that is right on the edge of happening, or not, depending on what we do or fail to do, to really let our voices be heard about protecting the ocean, at least hitting the pause button, put a moratorium, as we have on killing whales. There's a moratorium on not taking whales commercially. So, might we not safeguard the blue heart of the planet? Put the pause button on. Let's figure it out. Let's see what is actually out there. What is the connection between life in the deep sea and climate and weather? To be able to get down there is a big deal. And mostly we use remote systems like this big machine that goes down to the average depth, even deeper, down to 3 or 4 miles beneath the surface, even 5 miles. You sit up on the surface on a boat, you look at the images that come back from those remote, like our satellites that we have, or like the Mars rover. Frankly, although I really love the images that come back, I like diving in, and I hope if you haven't already taken the plunge, that you too will immerse yourself in the blue heart of the planet, the ocean, or a river, or lake, or stream, somewhere where you can understand the perspective of most of life on Earth. So I've had the privilege of living underwater now 10 times. You get into a little, looks like an underwater trailer. It's kind of like that. You have all the amenities, like the space station up in the sky. But the great thing is there's a hole in the floor that you can come out of and swim into the ocean and not stay the way those on the space station have to be contained most of the time, except for the lucky skywalkers who can get outside. Being in the ocean enables you to do what Jane Goodall has done in the forests, or you name the scientist of your choice, the George Shallers, who studied pandas and snow leopards, or you, bird watchers, anybody. We can get out and into the wilderness and get acquainted with the creatures there. Getting acquainted with life in the sea, it takes a little doing. You have to get out there, get wet, feel the ocean, and see these creatures and realize you think you're going out there to see them. Well, think again. They're curious. They come right over, look at you. And I think getting into the ocean creates an empathy for life that is hard to imagine when only you ever get to know a fish when it's in chowder or fish and sticks, or you don't even know who it is. The 30 or so thousand kinds of fish, we lump them together kind of as fish. We don't do that with chickens and cows and pigs. At least you know what animal you're eating. With fish, you have no idea. Even with shrimp or lobsters, there are many kinds that come together under one name. So, I do love getting out there and getting wet, but I also love going deeper, contained in a little shell, the way astronauts who go high in the sky can't just, walk out without a special spacesuit. This is a kind of space suit, if you will, a little sphere that can take people. People now have been to the deepest parts of the ocean, 7 miles down. Not many, about a dozen people have made the trip and come back. I want to share with you an image of somebody who is a newcomer to using submersibles. This is the Minister of the Environment for Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands are under his jurisdiction. He is a diver, but he had a chance last summer to go in a little submarine. He was a little apprehensive. But I think it really changed his perspective on the waters around the Galapagos Islands where this was taken. Again, you think you're going down there to look at the creatures? Well, look what happened. As we were exploring the depths, up came a mola mola and had a word with a minister. You think, that's the kind of experience I wish I could share with all of you, and I hope it won't be too long before there will be, like Hertz Rent-A-Subs, or you talk about a chicken in every pot, how about a submarine in every garage? I mean, we have the best time in all of history to look at nature, land and see ourselves with a different perspective. We're such newcomers on these ancient, innocent systems. And we have a choice. They do not. Elephants can't make the decisions about the future of the planet, nor can whales, or plankton, or squid. It really is up to us to choose not only the future we want, well, it has to be the future that's good for the rest of life as well, because we need them. Now they need us to kind of wake up and shape up. Ed Wilson, who's just a hero of mine, his specialty is ants, but his real specialty is looking at all of nature and our relationship to it. And on his 80th birthday, he remarked during a big celebration in New York, his concern that we're letting nature slip through our fingers. But the real concern, really, is that nature will let us slip through hers. We are on the edge, tipping points, where what we do or fail to do, like deep sea mining, we don't really have to do this. What we really have to do is protect the systems, the aquatic systems that keep us alive. So one measure is what I've been doing for really most of my life, but especially the last 10 years or so, to try to work with organizations and governments, people, everybody, take care of the water, the rivers, the lakes, the streams, take care of the ocean. Hope spots, areas where communities and individuals are stepping up. 150 areas in the ocean now are backed by champions, by communities who've committed to doing what they can to go from where we are right now. 3% of the ocean is protected. 97% of the ocean is open for exploitation, including the high seas, half the world that is on the chopping block right now, depending on what we do or fail to do. This is our time. 21st century humans, you're the luckiest people ever to arrive because of what we know, and also the best chance we'll ever have to turn from what appears to be tipping points in the wrong direction. But we can tip because we know what to do to go in the other direction. Cause for hope. Thank you.
I told you they made me feel bad about myself. Candice Millard. Candice Millard is a historian whose books strike the bestseller lists like clockwork. Her most recent is River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile, which the New York Times called a lean, fast-paced account of the almost absurdly dangerous quest by those two friends turned enemies, Richard Burton and John Speke, I meant to ask if I was pronouncing that right, John Speke, to solve the geographic riddle of their era. Rivers have appeared elsewhere in her work, perhaps most prominently in her 2005 book, The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, which is about Roosevelt's exploration of a tributary of the Amazon. She's also written books about James Garfield and Winston Churchill. It's no surprise that she's a mainstay on the bestseller list. As one reviewer put it, her work is eminently readable and exceptionally informative, a great combination, or as another put it about her book on Churchill, it's as involving as a popcorn thriller. So happy to have Candice with us here today, and she's our next presenter.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, although I can't believe I have to follow Sylvia Earle. It doesn't seem fair, but anyway, thank you for having me. So yes, I've written 2 books about 2 different rivers, the Nile, the longest river in the world, and the Rio de Dúvida, the River of Doubt. The reason I wrote about these rivers were the rivers themselves, of course, their beauty, their mystery, the life they give, and the life they can take. But I was also interested in these rivers because of the men who sought and failed to master them. Among the many things I learned when I worked at National Geographic magazine was that there is no geographical feature that human beings will not try to make their own in some way. We try to climb them, cross them, swim them, map them, and plant flags in them, claim them and name them, and often rename them even when they have perfectly good names already. Some of this instinct for exploration comes from wanderlust, from a desire to understand the world in which we live. It's one of the most basic and necessary human qualities, curiosity. But often, it also comes from a desire to own, to control, and to colonize. As Samuel Johnson famously said, "I do not wish well to discoveries, for I am always afraid that they will end in conquest and robbery." My first book, The River of Doubt, is about the first instinct, not control, but curiosity. And no one was more curious about or fascinated with the world in which we live than Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think it's working.
Green one's not working.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
That's all right, I can keep talking. As you know, Roosevelt was a soldier, a politician, a president, but above all else, he was a naturalist. From childhood, he closely, even obsessively studied birds and mammals, kept his own collections, wrote books and articles. He was a lifelong hunter, but he was also a fierce conservationist. He established 5 national parks, 51 bird reserves, and 150 national forests, protecting about 230 million miles of public land. In 1914, at the age of 55, he also took an insanely dangerous trip down an unmapped river in the Amazon, the River of Doubt. This was a serious scientific expedition that became an extraordinary story of survival. During this trip, Roosevelt and his men lost nearly all of their supplies to rapids. 1 man drowned, another man was murdered, the rest, including Roosevelt's own son, nearly starved, and the survivors emerged from the jungle in rags. Roosevelt himself became gravely injured and nearly took his own life in an attempt to save the other men. The Amazon River, as you know, runs west to east. The River of Doubt, which got its name because no one had any idea where its headwaters led, runs south to north. It begins in the Brazilian highlands and runs north into the Amazon basin. It is a principal tributary of the Madeira, which is the principal tributary of the Amazon. But unlike the Amazon, which is wide and sluggish, the River of Doubt is fast, twisting, and choked with rapids. It also runs through the greatest natural battlefield on Earth. It is a place where animals have evolved an amazing range of specialized skills and features. plants that can change from a bush to a vine to a tree, depending on the sunlight, moths with 6-inch long tongues, fish that can leap 6 feet out of a river and snatch insects, lizards, and even small birds. In fact, the only creatures not getting anything to eat were Roosevelt and his men. They had come expecting to live off the land, but not only could they not kill game, they couldn't even find it. Compared to the creatures of the jungle, they were clumsy and conspicuous. They had also come believing that they could defend themselves against any indigenous people they might meet. But here again, they found themselves completely outmatched. The jungle near the River of Doubt is inhabited by the Cinta Larga. Cinta Larga means wide belt in Portuguese. They're named for the broad strips of bark that they wrap around their waists to protect themselves during war. The Cinta Larga knew almost nothing of the outside world. In fact, they would have no official contact with the rest of the world until the late 1960s. Roosevelt and his men were the first white men they had ever seen, and they weren't even sure they were human. In the eyes of the Cinta Larga, they were pale, hairy, wearing clothes, and they were riding in boats. And although the Cinta Larga lived on the banks of a river, they had not yet developed boats. But they were incredibly sophisticated when it came to surviving in the jungle. They could move quickly and quietly, following extremely subtly marked trails. They found game the expedition couldn't find, or even see or hear. They killed it with very effective weapons, using arrows and natural poisons. For Roosevelt and his men, this expedition was about adventure and survival. It also underscores the questions we face regarding the future of the Amazon and regions like it. It doesn't take much exposure to the Amazon to come away with an almost overwhelming feeling of awe and respect for nature. The tragedy is that the very sacrifices that Roosevelt and his men made to try to understand the region have set the stage for its destruction. As so often happens, exploration encourages development, and the first man in is never the last. A telegraph line that Roosevelt's Brazilian commander, the legendary Cândido Rondon, had strung through the Amazon became a highway in the late 1960s, and it is infamous among anthropologists and conservationists because it has led to widespread deforestation and made the Cinta Larga and those like them much more vulnerable to the outside world. This turn of events would have horrified Roosevelt and Rondon, and were they alive today, I think that they would be devoting the same energy to trying to protect the Amazon that they did to exploring it. Unfortunately, as we know, protecting what they explored was rarely foremost on the minds of 19th and early 20th century explorers. Their expeditions were about curiosity, but more than that, they were about control, about trying to master what was not theirs. They also wanted to be remembered for solving a great geographical mystery, and there was no greater mystery in the history of exploration than the source of the Nile. Not only is the Nile the longest and most storied river in the world, covering more than 4,000 miles on its journey to the Mediterranean Sea, but it makes possible Egypt, one of the oldest and richest continuous civilizations in history. The question was, where did it begin? It was a tantalizing, maddening mystery that for millennia captivated and frustrated everyone from ancient philosophers to Egyptian kings. The Nile is made up of two primary branches, the white and the blue. The white, which is named for the light gray silt that gives its waters a milky hue, is longer and joins the darker blue Nile near Khartoum in Sudan. A Spanish Jesuit discovered the source of the blue Nile, Lake Tana, in northern Ethiopia in 1618. But more than 200 years later, the source of the white Nile remained a mystery. Finally, in the mid-1800s, the Royal Geographical Society decided to send an expedition to East Africa to solve this ages-old mystery and to try to claim the prize for England. Rather than begin in the north and attempt to ascend the river, as so many had tried and failed to do over millennia, they would begin on the east coast of Africa, well below the equator, and proceed inland in search of the elusive source of the Nile. They just needed to find the right man to lead the expedition. Few men were as qualified as Richard Francis Burton. Burton was already an incredibly accomplished explorer. He had been the first Englishman to enter Mecca disguised as a Muslim, a journey that few others had either the skill or the audacity to make. He spoke more than 25 different languages, and he was an extraordinarily gifted and prolific writer. But no matter what he accomplished, he was always considered an outsider in England, always looked upon with suspicion and distrust. He had been born in Devon to British parents, but he was raised in Europe, moving 13 times before his 18th birthday. He did attend Oxford, but he was bullied and bored there and ended up engineering his own expulsion. He was openly, emphatically agnostic, studying every religion and respecting none. And he also had the fatal flaw of not looking particularly British in the eyes of his countrymen. He had his English-Irish father's black hair and piercing black eyes, which he claimed to use to hypnotize women. And he had an absolutely unforgettable face. None other than Bram Stoker, who would go on to write Dracula, was obsessed with him. "The man riveted my attention," Stoker wrote after meeting Burton. "He was dark and forceful and masterful and ruthless. I never saw anyone like him. He is steel. He would go through you like a sword." He was especially fascinated by Burton's teeth, writing that when Burton talked, his canine tooth showed its full length like the gleam of a dagger. Burton's second in command was a man who was as unremarkable as Burton was extraordinary. John Hanning Speke was everything Britons expected their heroes to be. He was blonde and blue-eyed, born into the aristocracy, an officer in the British Army. He was puritanical and prim, priding himself on his discipline and judging others harshly if, in his eyes, they fell short. Speke was also deeply, dangerously resentful of his commander, a festering bitterness that remained unspoken for years, building with each offense Burton unknowingly gave, each achievement or accolade that Burton received and Speke did not. For years, Speke simmered with barely contained anger and envy until finally it boiled over, leaving Burton shocked and bewildered, and in the end, destroying them both. There was, however, one man in the expedition who was loyal and capable and trustworthy, everything Burton had hoped Speke would be. And he became not just the most important member of this expedition, but arguably the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration. His name was Sidi Mubarak Bombay. Kidnapped from his village in East Africa when he was just a child, Bombay had been sold for cloth in Zanzibar, and then forced onto a ship traveling to India, where he had been enslaved for some 20 years. Finally freed when the man who owned him died, he had made his way back to the continent of his birth, where he met Burton and Speke. Bombay was the heart and in many ways the hero of Burton's expedition. He would also go on to achieve what Burton and Speke would never be able to do, even with all their resources, advantages, and ambition. Not only did Bombay travel with Burton and Speke to Lake Tanganyika, which Burton hoped was the source of the Nile, but he was with Speke when, in a brutal twist of fate, he and not Burton became the first European to reach the Nyanza, the largest lake in Africa and the actual source of the White Nile, which Speke, of course, would rename for his own queen, Victoria. Then he helped Henry Morton Stanley find David Livingstone. You know Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That was Bombay. And then, with Bernie Levitt Cameron, Bombay became the first to cross the entire continent of Africa, from east to west, sea to sea. Bombay likely did not fully understand why British and European explorers were going to such extreme efforts to understand his homeland, but the explorers certainly did. They knew that the direct result of these expeditions would not only be to map Africa, but to seize it, region by region. In what would become known as a scramble for Africa, the continent was invaded, occupied, and colonized. By the early 1900s, 7 European countries would control more than 90% of Africa. Although these two expeditions, Roosevelt and Rondon on the River of Doubt, and Burton's Speke in Bombay, searching for the source of the Nile, may have begun with different motives. In the end, they had similar results. Both stories are cautionary tales. Beware obsession in all of its many dangerous forms. Beware the temptation to try to control, to master what has never been and will never be ours. And perhaps most of all, beware the threat of arrogance, of believing that you can discover a land that had been inhabited by millions of people for hundreds of thousands of years, that you understand a region or a continent better than the people who live there, and that you can somehow improve their lives by seizing their land and resources, appropriating their history and their culture. If we can learn anything from the past, from humankind's greatest achievements and most devastating mistakes, from our most revered heroes and despised villains, it is that arrogance and ignorance always go hand in hand. And the only way to free ourselves from their terrible legacy is to keep a clear and steady eye on our history and to use that knowledge again and again to correct our course. Thank you so much.
Love the idea of Bram Stoker hashtagging obsessed about Richard Burton if he was on Instagram. Simon Winchester has written so many books about so many different subjects that he might have been here today almost no matter what the theme was. We'll get to his work about rivers. His breakout bestseller, megaseller really, in 1998 was The Professor and the Madman. He's adept at telling very specific stories like that one or his book about the eruption of Krakatoa, but he's also not afraid to take on such modestly limited subjects as land, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. It's always a thrill to see where he'll turn his attention and talents next, and he has a new book out just days from now. This one is called Knowing What We Know, The Transmission of Knowledge from Ancient Wisdom to Modern Magic. But fear not, he has written about rivers. In 1996, he published The River at the Center of the World, a journey up the Yangtze and back in Chinese time, an incredible mix of travelogue and history. And in 2020, he wrote The End of the River about the fate of America's most iconic waterway, with apologies to the Rio Grande, the Mississippi. Simon, come wow us.
Thanks very much indeed. It is weird to be back here because I was a Guardian reporter here in 1972 and covered Watergate. So walking past Watergate, strange shivers, John Dean, Sam Irvin, all those people I grew up on, cut my teeth on. But I'm going to talk to you today a bit about two rivers, and I think the theme is rivers or the waters we seek to master. And these are two things that we came across that are well known, in which we have attempted to master these two rivers and, to a degree, perhaps in the future, perhaps not now, are failing to do so. Mark Twain, above all, said, the Mississippi is something absolutely impossible to master. But I want to talk first of all about the Yangtze, which I was living in Hong Kong from the mid-80s to the mid-90s and preparing for the handover when the Chinese quite rightly took Hong Kong back in June the 30th, 1997. I've been fascinated by the Yangtze, not least because being an east-west river, it neatly separates China in two. North of the Yangtze, people tend to eat noodles, they raise wheat and so forth. On the south, it's rice, and so there's a cultural difference on the two sides of this river. And I thought for a long time it would be rather nifty to go up the river the whole way and write essentially about Chinese history as you moved up the river. So I had a very good friend, extremely tall, and a woman called Lily, well, we called her Lily anyway. She was a Manchu from the northeast of China, a very fierce personality, and it's very difficult to travel, at least it was in those days, in Western China, going up to Tibet, and I figured I needed someone strong and powerful personality to help me, as turned out very, very much the case. So we set off from the bar, the Wusong Bar, which is where ships move out into the South China Sea, and moved upwards, and took I think about 9 months to do the whole journey. And you go, first of all, of course, to Shanghai, very much a European city for much of its history, and then further inland you go to Nanking, as it was, Nanjing now, with all the horrible stories of things that happened in the 1930s, and then to Wuhan, which is the then-known Hankow back in colonial days, enormously well known today because of the origins of COVID, whether from a laboratory or from a market, we'll probably never know. And then through the Three Gorges, a great sort of tourist place where the Yangtze squeezes itself between these three mountain ranges and ends up in Chongqing or Chongqing, or used to be the Stilwell's capital, and it was free from the Japanese invasions in the 30s, so that was briefly the capital of China. And then it gets really wild and woolly and starts going up into where it rises in the on the plateau of Tibet. And so we went the whole way from tea-growing countryside and the fairly sort of slow-flowing river into the somewhat more exciting part of the river, the Three Gorges. I was very interested by a man, and I've got to keep my eye on the clock because there is so much to talk about, and I want to bring the Mississippi into this because it's also important. But there was a figure, a great hero of mine, called Cornell Plant, an Englishman who was, he ran the paddle steamers that ran on the Tigris and Euphrates River Navigation Company, which just strikes me as one of the most wonderful jobs in the world, sort of rivaling Sylvia's title. I mean, to be chief officer of the Tigris and the Euphrates Steam Navigation Company seemed wonderful. And then he was transferred himself to the Yangtze and worked out the way to navigate ships, powered ships, upstream through the Three Gorges, which are fiercely rough and tumbling rapids. The boats used to be hauled by these men called trackers, who, loincloths and barefoot, grabbing onto bamboo hawsers in little pathways in the banks, hauling junks upstream. I mean, it took weeks to get a junk full of rice to go upstream. Then in 1906, I think an Englishman managed to get a steam-powered ship up through the Three Gorges, and then Cornell Plant went there in the 20s and created the maps of the way that you actually work your way through safely. And he retired there in a bungalow built high up on the cliffs, and he would, a ship would come past, he'd be out there, an elderly man now, waving his white handkerchief, saying, you're going the right way, you're doing the right thing. And there's a memorial, the only memorial to a Westerner on the banks of the Yangtze, stood for many years near the town of Sandoping, and I would sort of tip my hat to it as I went past. But the important thing about that is that Sandoping is where they decided, and this is the attempt to master the river, they decided to build a dam, because the Yangtze falls over its length of 3,500, 4,000 miles, I think it is, some 8,000 feet. So it's the potential to generate electricity and also to prevent downstream flooding was realized almost immediately after the revolution. I mean, Sun Yat-sen wrote a paper about it in, I think, 1919, saying one day we'll dam this river. Well, shambles that was China in the years after 1919 put paid to that. But then Mao Zedong wrote a poem about a great wall rises across the river. I dream of a day when one day a wall of stone will rise to stop the river in its tracks. And of course, if the great helmsman said such a thing, then his acolytes were bound to follow and do as he bade them. And so when I went up there for this book with Lily, they were already doing the blasting and preparing to build what has become the greatest dam in the world. I want briefly to skip past the dam. I'll come back to it in a moment. So Lily and I went into the mountains of the west, heading north. The river essentially goes westwards. It wiggles about a bit, but then suddenly turns northwards And there are 4 rivers, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and the Yangtze, all go through this relatively narrow defile and then to their sources up in various parts of the Tibetan plateau. Forbidden country in those days. I always remember this horrible moment when we were going on a track beside the river when there was a burly policeman who said, absolutely no, you cannot go any further. And he puffed out his chest after some 20 minutes of arguing and said, I have never let a Westerner up this road in my entire career. And Lily said, we need to talk about this. This man Winchester is a professor of geography, which is complete nonsense, of course. But, and she went into his hut to persuade him. And she came out half an hour later in tears, but with a piece of paper saying, you can go. And she never, ever told me what had happened. I've often wondered, well, I sort of imagine I know. And we had another bizarre experience when we got up onto the Tibetan plateau. The Yangtze rises at a place called Gelendandong, up near a place called Tuotuohuyan, all very long words up in Tibet. And Lily got very badly sick with altitude sickness, because you're up at about 13,000 feet. It was June, it was bitterly, bitterly cold, there was a snowstorm, and we knew we could see there was a Chinese army barracks, so we went down there, and if you can imagine, it's night, snow in our face, Lily hunched over with emphysema, not emphysema, but bad rails, these horrible coughs you get when you get altitude sick, hammer on this iron door, and eventually the door opens and a Chinese army officer was there, and we said, well, we're stranded here, this man's a Westerner and I'm ill, can you help us? And he said, no, absolutely, go away. And Lily said, this is ridiculous. He said, no, you've got to go away because he's a Westerner and we don't allow Westerners into Chinese army camps. But also, 10 of our men died last night because of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty pipe in a heater because it suddenly got so cold. And Lily, clever woman that she said, well, in that case, that means you've got 10 spare beds. And he said, he cracked this smile. It was really weird. And he said, okay, come in as long as you help us move the bodies. So we had to move 10 bodies into a sort of warehouse and then slept very comfortably and then went off to go to the actual source of the river. And I had a Tibetan stamp with me, a sort of wooden thing with home on it. And I got to the actual source where you see it coming, dripping from a rock into what became a stream, which then became a huge river. And in those days, I smoked a cigar, and I had a cigar which I had bought at the Mandarin Hotel in Hong Kong, and I lit it. There were yaks everywhere. There was the fragrance of the cigar, and I'm pressing this seal of prayers that would go all the way down 3,500, 4,000 miles to Shanghai. But back briefly, anyway, to the dam. They were building the dam, started in 94, against all the protestations of the world, saying you cannot do this to this river because it's going to be dangerous, and anyway, the dam went up. It is the biggest dam, bar none, in the world, 22,000 megawatts. Huge, I think it's 19 turbines or something. But it's causing, in the 400 or so mile-long lake upstream of the dam, all sorts of landslides. And the US Geological Survey here is very worried that it's causing geological instability. The isostatic balance is changing and so forth. And if that were to happen, and the dam were to fail, then yes, it controls floods downstream of itself at the moment, but if it were to fail, it would completely inundate and wipe out Wuhan, which is a city of, goodness knows, 15 million people. It would be an unparalleled disaster. And of course, it's number one on the target list, it is said, of Taiwanese terrorists, if that's to be believed. So it's festooned with anti-aircraft missiles and things. The jewel in the crown, if it was interior China at the moment, but something which, if interfered with, will do amazing damage. So it's caused a huge amount of pollution upstream. It's 3.5 million people had to be moved to make way for it. But the one thing charming, I mean, I think the thing is a monstrosity. I think it should never have been built. But charmingly, so in love with the local people, even though the Red Guards had tried to destroy it, the Cornell Plant Memorial was painstakingly dismantled and taken up 800 feet and now stands on top of a mountain. So you can still see a memorial to this Englishman who waved his handkerchief boats back in the day when they used to travel carrying rice upstream from Wuhan to Chongqing. So number one, don't mess with the Yangtze, because ultimately the Yangtze will mess with you. And much the same thing, I think, needs to be said about the Mississippi. See how many minutes you see? No, that's my buzzer. Are you going to allow me 3 more minutes?
Simon, please, of course.
Honestly, well, this is, okay,
Yeah.
so instead of going upstream from where it debouches into the China Sea up to Guelin-Dandong, with the Mississippi, I went downstream from Lake Itasca, and incidentally, a completely made-up name. It's neither Latin nor Ojibwe. It's nothing to do with anything. It's just the fantasy of some guy that made its name. Rises in Lake Itasca in Minnesota and comes all the way down, relatively short river compared to these big fellows, down to New Orleans. It is essentially, in all of its thousands of miles, an artificial river, hemmed in by the US Army Corps of Engineers who've built and maintained all the dams on it, and it's an artery mainly for commerce. Its artificiality begins at the very start of the river. Lake Itasca is basically a swamp, and it's a most unattractive start to any river. But it's also not the start. I mean, the river there's a tiny stream to the west of Lake Itasca that is, but was made in the 1930s. It was decided this is the start of America's most noble river. So it's got to have a suitably portentous source. And so there is a pillar which says source of the Mississippi, 1,457 feet above sea level, blah, blah, blah. And then there's a little stream which flows out of this lake, beautiful little stream with little rills of water, and there are stepping stones over it. And you think, this is really rather charming. But it's totally artificial, because underneath it is, I think, 60,000 tons of concrete that were laid there by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1932, I think it was, to make a suitably grand beginning to America's grandest river. And it continues from there down. The Ojibwe have a lot of sway in these parts of the upper Mississippi, and they still are allowed to grow the wild rice and so on and so forth that we know them from. Then it gets to St. Paul, and then it becomes more canalized, and there are dams and wing dikes and things. But the crucial point was when it comes to northern Louisiana, where there were all these millions of oxbow lakes. I mean, if the map that you showed earlier about the Rio Grande is paralleled in extreme by the maps that are made by the USGS of Louisiana. Extraordinary the way the river changes. And a man called Shreve, who gave his name to Shreveport, tried to make a cut across one of these oxbow lakes in the 1870s, I think it was, so that paddle steamers could go upstream, and clearing it of the logs and mud and stuff. That it took 2 or 3 years to crush all this stuff and to create what's called to this day Shreve's Cut. But inadvertently, what he did was he brought the Mississippi dangerously, this is very technical and I won't go into it, not least because I've got -5 minutes. But there's a river that runs essentially parallel to it called the Atchafalaya, which rises in or flows through Oklahoma as the Red River, comes very, very close to within about 40 miles of the Mississippi. And what Shreve did was he made the two rivers get even closer to one another, with giving the fear that the Mississippi might flow into the Atchafalaya, because it's 40 feet lower and very, very little distance apart. And so they created a number of dam structures called the Old River Control Structure, which, although it sounds boring and mundane and prosaic, remember the Old River Control Structure, because if that ever fails, and it might with these hugely great rainfalls that now the Mississippi is being subjected to, causing the dam, which is a pretty fragile dam, not a very big dam, but if it were to fail, then the Mississippi would change its course. The process is known as avulsion, and it would go to where it naturally wants to go, which is to a nearby river 40 feet lower than it is. If that were to happen, it would cease almost overnight to flow through Baton Rouge, and most crucially, flow through New Orleans, which gets all of its fresh water from the Mississippi. Those two cities would die almost overnight, and the new great southern city of the Gulf of Mexico would be somewhere that you've all probably never heard of, which is called Morgan City, Louisiana. Morgan City will be the new New Orleans, and New Orleans will be over. So don't mess with the Mississippi either. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That's all very troubling, although, and maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, but maybe the silver lining is to buy real estate in Morgan City? I don't know. I should have kept that to myself, maybe. I'll make a phone call afterwards. We don't have much time. I think you all are signing books afterwards, so hopefully you'll get a chance to. I do have just one or two quick questions that I'm interested in. Maybe we'll have time for one from the audience. The main one is I'm very interested in human temperament and what makes people act like themselves and react to things and desire things in the way that they do. And in researching this subject and that use of the word master in the title, which you pointed out, Simon, it seems to me that rivers attract very obsessive, wild, and sometimes controlling types. But you all seem like very lovely, mild-mannered people. And so what I'm curious about is whether there is something inside of you, there is a kernel of that, or whether, since you're not that way, you're drawn to explore those people and sort of see your opposite, and how that maybe has played a role in your research, because I imagine you've been out on some of these waterways and done some harrowing things, maybe. Candice, you want to go first?
Yes, so I'm very much an introvert, and but working at National Geographic especially, I was just fascinated by explorers, people who are extremely brave and go into these very difficult and dangerous situations, and so that's sort of what drew me. And you're absolutely right. I think that especially in a time when we didn't have satellite pictures, we didn't know what the world contained, and we didn't know where these rivers began or sometimes where they led. And so I was fascinated by people who wanted to solve these great mysteries. But yeah, I'll tell a quick story about sometimes inadvertently things happen to you along the way. When I was doing the research for River of the Gods, my book about Burton Speak in Bombay, I was in Tanzania and Uganda and Zanzibar. But when I was in Tanzania, I went to Lake Tanganyika, which is far west. And I was just saying I had a chance actually to visit Gombe, Jane Goodall's research institute. Sadly, she wasn't there, but I did do a chimp trek. But one day I was trying to go from one bank to the other, and this is an enormous, the Nyanza, like I said, is the largest lake in Africa, the second largest lake in the world. But the Tanzania is one of the longest, I think it's actually the longest lake in the world, and one of the deepest too. It's just huge. And I was waiting for this boat to take me, and there had been a big storm, and it was getting later and later. So by the time the boat finally gets to me, it's dark. And it's not a very big boat. It can hold maybe 8 people. It's an open wooden boat. And you feel like you're on the sea, on the ocean when you're on it. And this trip was a trip of a couple of hours to get to the other bank. And the waters were still extremely rough. Excuse me. And so we start going, and we are tipping like all the way to one side and all the way to the next. And my husband was with me, and I was honestly terrified. And I looked at him and I said, look how far that other bank is. If we capsize, there's no way we can swim that far. And he said, don't worry about it. The crocodiles will eat us before we get very far. They would have. So you sometimes have your own adventures, even if you don't want to.
Yeah. I'm way more introverted than that. So you're somewhere on the introvert scale. But Simon, it sounds like a lot of your adventures in China were harrowing, but what percentage of the trip was harrowing? Were there days that just passed calmly?
Not really. No, it was. I mean,
good for the book.
Good for the book, exactly. I didn't make it up. No, there were all sorts of extraordinary things that happened. I was torn, and I went there recently to take some tourists. I don't think you can see it on this map, but basically when I mentioned that the river comes shooting down from the Tibetan plateau, and the Mekong and the Brahmaputra and the Salween, they go their own sweet ways through, what would it be, Vietnam and Cambodia and India. But the Yangtze turns east, and it does so at a tiny little town where you can go to, and you stand looking at the Yangtze, and you see it coming down from the Tibetan plateau on the left, then bouncing in front of you at a great wall of rock and heading back north. And there's a mountain behind you called Cloud Mountain. If it hadn't bounced back, if that piece of granite, piece of granite sort of a mile thick or something, hadn't been there, then the Yangtze would have flown into Vietnam and would have come out somewhere near the Mekong. But in fact, it headed east and then became the most important river in China, and arguably in terms of economics and so forth, the most important river in the world. An accident of geology. And I'd studied geology at university, so it's dear to my heart. But I love the fact that a simple piece of granite changed the course of history. Sylvia, you'd like that kind of a story, wouldn't you?
I'm going to ask one quick follow-up with both you and Sylvia that are a little different. With you, you talked about the mythology of the Old West and how you felt that when you were there. And I'm wondering, you've written and talked eloquently about why you wanted to go there to sort of see the real version of it. But I also wonder, was there a part of you that you sensed that was also drawn to mythology, or that felt like even as you wanted to see the real thing, there was something about the romance of all of that that also pulled you there?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I grew up in Arizona, watching like Bonanza on the like 2 TV stations that we got in West Texas or something like that. So, I think like the mythology of the West, the cowboy mythology, I mean, it's probably the overarching American mythology of sort of like one, the individual sort of like being the most powerful unit of society, kind of changing, with the power to change anything. It was like the naivete that led me to join the Border Patrol. I was like, oh, I can be part of this institution and work to change it from the inside. And so I think that those mythologies definitely shape my life and follow me. And I think a lot as a teacher and instructor about those mythologies. I got to travel with a group of students on the Rio Grande, and it was one of these, it was a river trip that was also like a writing workshop, and so we were bringing these students down. And the whole time in my head I was sort of worried that, like, I talked about Big Bend. It was a river trip through the canyons of Big Bend, and as a sort of island where like all these other rules of the rigidity and the sort of militarization of the border don't apply. And I was just like so preoccupied the whole time that as we were having this idyllic experience, sort of, traveling, the river was very low. It's like very slow trip, lazy trip through the canyons, camping on both sides of the border. And on our last night, just like kind of constantly reminding these students, like, oh, this is not, like, this is the exception. There's all these other, and, on our last night, we sort of made camp every night, like, very close to the river. It had rained upstream quite a lot. And, we woke up to, like, people screaming that their tents were being flooded with water. And we had to move our camp in the middle of the night. Our river guides got marooned on what became an island as the waters were rising, and lost a bunch of canoes, and lost the satellite phone. So just like all this, and it was the last night of the trip. And I think it was another sort of like the river, like reminding everybody.
Yeah,
just like
you tempted fate.
Yeah,
by describing it as idyllic. Yeah.
Yeah, the river is like. Yeah, I'm not going to be idyllic even in this sort of like natural state. Yeah.
Sylvia, lightning question, and I apologize that we ran short on time, but we do have to go in a couple minutes. When you showed that picture of the Earth, and I've seen videos of you speaking about this elsewhere, about how the astronauts version kind of really did give us a new, like, humanity got a new sense of our place in the universe. But I wonder if, because you had already gotten interested in nature by then. Did you, when you were young, like when you saw that picture for the first time, did it surprise you, or did you feel like you already had a sense of that inside of you, even though you couldn't see that view yet?
That view of Earth, I think, was transformative for all of us. Even though in the classroom you can see globes that really emphasize the land with the boundaries, names on everything, from high in the sky, all that disappears, and it's mostly blue. It really is. That's the graphic way of getting it, if you will. But the other view is to get down in the ocean and realize that this is where the action is. And it's where the longest, strongest rivers are, too. We call them ocean currents. And to be in the ocean, to realize what we see at the surface, like the Gulf Stream, or the current that comes up sweeping along the coast of Chile, or the one that comes sweeping down the east coast of Africa. Because we're terrestrial, we think of the surface currents as being, now we know, now we, in the 21st century, and toward the end of the 20th, but never before, how the circulation of the ocean that really moves heat and cold, and of course water and life, and all of the elements around the world. This is like a great mixing system. They call it the system of
It's like a circulatory
rivers in
system.
the ocean, if you
Yeah.
will. It's to be in a little submarine and you go down, it's nice and quiet, and then all of a sudden, the power that you have that can move you forward maybe at 2 miles an hour, maybe 3 miles an hour, suddenly you're swept away. You can't fight the current, the river.
It's like turbulence.
You don't see the bank,
Yeah.
but you certainly feel it. It's like you looking on the edge and seeing this great expanse ahead of you. Well, it kind of looks the same,
Amazing.
but then all of a sudden it isn't the same.
So glad you could be here. I just want to very, very quickly before we end thank Ginger Rogers at the Kennedy Center and Lena and Zach who helped us today, and the wonderful Maria Rana who invited me to do this, who will be doing this better than I did at 2 o'clock at another event. But mostly Simon Winchester, Candice Millard, Sylvia Earle, and Francisco Cantú. Thank them for being here, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.